All right, how is everyone doing today? Welcome to my channel. We do educational videos, and we like to take deep dives into great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, grand unified theories, magnum opuses, tour de forces, earth-shattering discoveries. These are things that that you can believe in every aspect of your life, things that you can use for your formation of a holistic worldview, your shifting of paradigms, your awakening to 5D consciousness, your quest for better spiritual, mental, and physical health. And today is our 180th day that we have been working on the Reciprocal Church. That is kind of compiling methods of spiritual edification, really creating that Sector 3, as Dewey Larson calls it, in his reciprocal system. Sector 3, kind of like our really level 3, our God particle, so to speak, that we have all have within us, and that we can evolve it, advance it, through various processes. And we're trying to compile as many of those processes as possible to use in a pragmatic way, especially as all of the Western religions begin to collapse under their own weight, particularly those that use the Bible as their basis. Once we recognize that the Bible, the New Testament, is entirely a psychological operation from the Romans, and the Old Testament is stitched together in various ways, but mostly plagiarized from much older sources in Sumeria, Acadia, Babylonia, and I guess Akkad in Babylonia, and that these things are being used to not only get us off the track, but also humiliate us. And at this point, I look upon them quite a bit like the belief in Santa Claus. At a certain point, we're going to have to kind of grow up here and recognize reality, and that there is no free lunch, and you have to stay engaged. You can't just believe in something and then that is your ticket out, especially when there's absolutely no evidence for any of it. And but people don't know that because they have never really gotten beyond the book. If you just stay within the book, everything's okay, and you have like circular reasoning to support you. But once you start looking at other sources from the same time period, and other methods of gaining information from that same time period, you can find out very quickly that these books are fraudulent. And this is particularly true in the work of so-called Josephus, who Christians used to, who was a Jew, incidentally. And Christians use him as a late first century person, born in, I believe, 37 AD. So did not live at the same time as Jesus was said to have lived, but later. But he is really the only source outside of the Bible that gives, in the first century, that testifies to the existence of Jesus. And so he's put on somewhat of a pedestal by Christians, and in the Middle Ages or the medieval times um, of the the Roman Empire, many many churches, Josephus's War of the Jews, and also Jewish antiquities of the Jews were actual bona fide books of the Bible. Eventually, everybody kind of got rid of them, except for this sect called the Preterists, in which the Josephus is still part of their canon. But the problem is that a lot of things that Jesus prophesies in the Bible come true in Josephus's supposed to be history of the War of the Jews. When Jesus is prophesying his second coming, he prophesies exactly what Titus does. Titus is the military general of the Romans during the War of the Jews between 66 and 73 AD. He eventually becomes the emperor, son of Vespasian, who was the first general in that war, but then became emperor in 69 AD. Titus replaced him after Vespasian died in 79 AD and ruled just for a couple of years plus. And then his brother Domitian took over until 96 AD. These are called the Flavian dynasty, or the Flavian Caesars. Flavian means blonde, by the way. And they are the ones who had the motive, they had the method, they had the means, and they had all of the motivations. They should be the first suspects for writing the Gospels. And they used this guy Josephus, whether he existed or not. He wrote up his autobiography, so he wrote up his own existence, basically. And he claims that he was a Jewish priest who eventually became one of the military leaders of the Jews against the Romans in this war. And this is after a century of smoldering insurrections and riots, and the Jews just would not absorb themselves into the Roman Empire like most of the other nations. And so the Jews were just a big pain for the Romans to deal with, especially after this 7-year-long war. And so the Romans created a new Jewish character, a new Jewish hero that believed in turning the other cheek and rendering unto Caesar what was Caesar's, and walking an extra mile with the Romans' heavy backpack. And this was done in order to kind of pacify the Jews, to mellow them out so that they could possibly be incorporated into the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was actually very tolerant of other religions, kind of as long as you gave Caesar his due. And so the Jews couldn't handle that, because the Jews had their temple. A couple of the Caesars tried to put their statues in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, and that didn't go well. They were the more zealous sects of the Jews would rather die than to see Caesar's graven image in their temple. So we're in this kind of survey here, we're going to be kind of disproving, or, if we find other evidence, maybe we'll be proving. We're going to be uncovering evidence for the New Testament. We're going to be first, in a little while, we're going over the book of Luke and looking at all the comparisons between Josephus and Luke, but for the whole New Testament. And this work kind of follows along with Joseph Atwill's work from Caesar's Messiah, Shakespeare's Secret Messiah. and also Michael Menescott's articles that kind of expand on Atwill's work, and several other sources that have all kind of postulated Caesar's writing of the New Testament. What I haven't mentioned is that Josephus was, after he was the general there, he surrendered to Vespasian, and he gave Vespasian the star prophecy, which is to say that he predicted that one day Vespasian would become emperor. And he, by doing that, he kind of, got in the good graces of Vespasian. Josephus had just the idea, I guess, that the feeling that God has changed his mind and God now favors the Romans instead of the Jews. And so he defected to the Romans. He was adopted by Vespasian as a son and lived basically the rest of his life at the Roman court. And so he was an agent of the Roman Empire. He wasn't just this historian guy who wrote about Jesus. Everything that he wrote was propaganda, and some truth, some not true. And that's kind of the question here, is that I don't really look at the New Testament as like strictly a psyop. It's kind of like it's a limited hangout. There are plenty of good things in the Bible, plenty of admonishments for good behavior that are definitely worthy of following. Some of the emulating some of Jesus's actions, and some of the other characters as well. But that is because the Romans wanted good citizens too. They didn't want, what they didn't want is zealot, kind of terrorists who were completely xenophobic and separatists within their empire. And so they put in a lot of, the good things that are in the Bible are actually not Christian, they're actually pagan. They are what you would say Egypto-Greco-Roman stuff, Neoplatonism, cynicism, and Stoicism. So these are the parts in the Bible that lead you to good behavior, and that even though I'm here pretty much telling you that the New Testament is a psyop, I still would consider myself an advocate of Christian values. I believe in those same values, mostly at least, but the truth is the truth. And it's very, very obvious once you start looking at the evidence, especially from Josephus. When you compare Josephus with the New Testament, and you compare Jesus's 3-year ministry with Titus's 3-year military campaign, then you see that the Romans not only are trying to deceive you with the Gospels, but they also are mocking you with it. The things that Jesus says as parables, as allegories, as metaphors, those things come to pass literally in Josephus's works, especially War of the Jews. So that's kind of the pattern. But then there's many other ways to decode the New Testament as well. And what we've been looking at lately is the Dead Sea Scrolls cipher for the New Testament. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the mid-20th century, about 1900 years after they had been deposited in these caves in Qumran, 20 miles from Jerusalem. And they have been pretty much kind of sequestered. They were assigned to they're written in Hebrew mainly, but a little Aramaic and Greek, and they have been they were assigned to this international team to translate them and catalog them and put it back out to the public. And most of them were Catholic priests, and when they saw what the documents actually said, it apparently said something they didn't like, and they started just stalling for time and diverting and obfuscating, and it really took like 35 years before these documents were out there. And by that time, the people that were now alive didn't really understand the significance of these documents. It's a huge find. There's like 800 separate works, and including every book of the Old Testament. There was a bunch of very strict Jews living there, and then they had also their sectarian material of what they believed in and how they went about their business, rituals and food restrictions and sex restrictions and all these different things. And those documents shed incredible amounts of light on first century Palestine and what was going on with the Christians. So we're going to take a look. Yesterday we were looking at some of Robert Eisenman's work, who was one of the main person that broke the logjam of the Dead Sea Scrolls and forced the international team to kind of take pictures of these scrolls and get them to other scholars and just the lay public. But that didn't happen until the early 1990s. And we were looking at his book called The New Testament Code. And he had some great things to say, I thought, in the first section. But that book is like 1,000 pages long. And so we're going to try to go through the introduction here, start the introduction of his much shorter book, which I think might help us with our decoding from the Dead Sea Scrolls perspective. Because many of the Dead Sea Scrolls use the same language, the same jargon that's used in the Gospels, but we don't really know what they mean. And so it gives you a code where you can then read through the Gospels, and when they kind of give you these code words, you know what they actually mean, what the inner significance of them is, as opposed to just this kind of superficial fundamentalist view where you just believe what it says, like I believe every word of the Bible. Let's start this. This is Eisenman's work called Maccabees, Zadokites, Christians, and Qumran. The Maccabees were the Jewish dynasty that successfully repelled the Greeks in like 167 BC, and kind of had a dynasty there in Palestine for about a century before they were kind of overthrown by the Herods. And then after that, that led to 100 years of unrest, where the remnants of the Maccabeans were insurrecting and trying to regain their sovereignty from Rome. Rome, I believe, sacked Jerusalem or took over in like 63 BC. And then they used these Herod kings, mainly kind of puppet pseudo-Jews, half-Jews, I think, that were kind of the puppet king of Judea. And the Zadokites were the priestly class that goes all the way back to King David, but also appears amongst the Maccabees. Okay, introduction. Various preconceptions have dominated Qumran research. These, in turn, have blurred the significance of documents of the most incalculable historical value. Okay, now this is a person who, one of the only people who has actually gone through all these documents. He says that they are of the most incalculable historical value. In this passages that we were reading yesterday, he said over and over again that the Dead Sea Scrolls change everything. Now, you know, you could say, well, this guy's a Jew. He's coming from the Jewish perspective. Well, right. So let's hear him out. And, you know, I'm not beholden to any of these theories. I don't necessarily believe that even Josephus even existed. And I don't necessarily even believe that the Dead Sea Scrolls, they could be fake too. So we just go through the evidence and then, you know, shake it out. Okay, so that only 35 years after their discovery, they have become objects of only passing interest to many scholars. Primarily, you know, he's referring to the Dead Sea Scrolls. He calls Qumran research. That's spelled Qumran, by the way. Primarily, these preconceptions stem from an animus towards and derogation of the Maccabean family and the additional underlying motive of trying to distance the materials in question as far as possible from Christianity's formative years in Palestine. So he's talking about the international team here. All of these Catholic priests, when they saw the Dead Sea Scrolls, they realized that they didn't say what they wanted them to say. And so they spent a lot of time and effort trying to do whatever they could possibly do to distance the Dead Sea Scrolls from the 1st century AD, when Christianity is being formed, to back it up, you know. So they would say, oh, they came from the 2nd century BC, you know, 200 years before. But there's a lot of evidence that indicates that that isn't true. These preconceptions subtly deform archaeological and paleographic studies, which we learned a few weeks ago is like the study of the evolution of handwriting used in order to date documents. You can date them by kind of the stylistic flair of the handwriting of the ancient texts. It certainly doesn't seem very precise to me, but going forward, and the international team relied a lot upon that, so that scholars end up with, quote, results that are psychologically and spiritually more in keeping with their original assumptions and beliefs. In turn, these are used to render solutions based on the clear thrust of internal data and the reality of the historical Sitz im Leben. I think that means situation, but I don't know. Stillborn. Though Josephus is properly recognized as the important source he is, his associations with both the Essene and Zealot movements and what we shall refer to as the Messianic, and his canny evasions resulting from these, are in large measure ignored. It is forgotten, too, that apart from the period 55 to 75 CE, when he was a mature observer, he too was working from sources he sometimes either treated too hastily or did not fully understand himself, and his confusions compound our own. I would say that Eisenman is being very generous here. He's pointing out that Josephus is working from sources. He wasn't there. So except for this period 55 to 75 AD when Josephus was like a young adult. But for the period before that, he was merely a child and, wasn't, what he calls a mature observer. But then when he says that he had confusions which compound our own, and he treated the sources too hastily and did not fully understand them. I think his motives were a lot darker than that. He wasn't confused, I don't believe. I believe he was putting down the history that he wanted to put down, wanted to put down because Titus and Vespasian wanted it put down in a certain way, and that he wrote both the New Testament and the War of the Jews. Or I won't say he. I would just really say more like the Josephus team, whoever is writing under that name. I would say that it was certainly more than one person. For example, Josephus takes notices, probably from different sources, about Herod's regard for both Pharisees and Essenes, and sets them side by side without realizing his sources were themselves most likely talking about the same group. This confusion of Pharisee and Essene terminologies is also at the root of the contradictory notices about Hasidians in Maccabees, Second Maccabees and First Maccabees, which are apocryphal Old Testament sources that were written really like right at that time, 1st century BC, 2nd century BC, as both the supporters of Judas, and this is, I believe, Judas the Galilean, who was the led an insurrection in, I think, 6 BC. So both the supporters of Judas par excellence and his betrayers, the Hasidians or Hasidim. Elsewhere, Josephus contradicts himself in what he says about James's nemesis, the high priest Ananus, heaping praise on him in the War of the Jews, while abusing him in the Antiquities of the Jews and the Vita, which is his autobiography. He wrote War of the Jews in the 70s, probably the late 70s AD, while the Antiquities of the Jews is from like the early 90s. And the Antiquities of the Jews is where what is called the Testimonium or something like that is, where he takes an aside for a paragraph and says that Jesus existed and that he was an incredible being. And many scholars contend that that was inserted centuries after the fact because it's a non sequitur. If you look at the paragraph before and after, neither of them have anything to do with the paragraph about Jesus. But Atwill convincingly claims that paragraph was inserted by Josephus and he shows the reasons for it. We will get to that. In fact, many startling omissions in the War of the Jews are made good in this way in the Antiquities and the Vita. Compounding this particular confusion, early church accounts insist that Josephus connected James's death with the fall of Jerusalem, which is precisely what he tells us about Ananus's in the extant copy of the war. So that indicates that his work, War of the Jews, was altered in a later period after the church fathers had already read it. The inability to come to grips with a whole new vocabulary in Hebrew also prevented many scholars from seeing through to the real implications of the materials before them, the Dead Sea Scrolls again. In particular, it proved difficult to recognize the Hebrew originals of familiar expressions known only through Greek, Latin, and more modern translations. For example, the way, perfection, knowledge or gnosis, works, justify, the Last Judgment, etc. Perhaps because of a dearth of really credible translations, specialists also found it difficult to come to grips with the use of interchangeable metaphor where the names of numerous familiar groups were concerned, such as Essenes, Zadokites, Ebionites, Nazarenes, the meek, the saints, zealots, etc. Excuse me. This is compounded by the basically secretive nature of the tradition, which itself was connected with an ongoing hidden tradition, and in turn accounts for the seemingly dizzying multiplication of sects and groups, when in fact one has to do essentially with one Essene or zealot type orientation. Part of the problem, too, stems from the inability to recognize subversive groups in what on the surface, anyhow, appear to be harmless ascetics. Here, Josephus is more forthcoming, albeit still using his familiar circumlocutions, when he tells us that the impostors and the deceivers were scheming to bring about both innovations and change in government. One must be prepared to put aside all preconceptions stemming from one's own terms of reference, usually either the viewpoints of rabbinic Judaism or Christianity, as it has devolved upon us, since the tradition under consideration is implacably hostile to both. For example, the authenticity of the letter of James has been consistently undermined from Eusebius's time to Luther's. But aside from some polishing and minimal ideological tinting, it fits perfectly into the materials of concern to us in this study, exhibiting that studied reticence in identifying its antagonists, which is usually the result of fear of powerful, hostile forces, is, quote, not one jot or tittle approach to Torah. Its constant stress on, quote, keeping, not breaking, the law, and its antagonism to fornication. All have their parallels in Qumran usage. Okay, we're trapped within an incredibly long paragraph with a bunch of parentheticals, so we're going to stop right there, and I'll find a good place to get started again. I think this will be useful to go through as we get ready to decode the book of Luke. So thanks for tuning in today, and have a great day.